I sent a photo to our family group chat, showing my frail wife after heart surgery, writing, "She wants to see everyone." But my son texted, "Busy. Handle it yourself." And my daughter added, "She survived. Stop making it our problem." Then I quietly replied, "It's okay." However, by 10 o'clock that night, the truth they saw on the live news broadcast left them so stunned that both of them immediately dropped their phones straight onto the cold, hard floor. Welcome to Dad's Revenge Stories. I'm so grateful you're here with me today. Which city or country are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Note: this story includes fictional elements crafted for entertainment and life lessons. Any resemblance to existing names or places is purely coincidental, but the core takeaway remains valuable. My name is Walter Bennett, and I am 67 years old. I have kept books clean for 35 years, balanced every ledger to the last penny, and prided myself on never writing down a number I could not defend. But the most important thing I ever recorded was not a figure in a column. It was a photograph. One photograph taken on the night of April 14th in a room that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, with my hands shaking so badly I had to press my elbows against my ribs just to hold the phone steady. Helen was the color of the sheet beneath her. There were more wires than I could count, thin ones snaking from her chest, to machines that beeped in rhythms I did not understand. Thick ones taped to the inside of her elbow, a clear tube running oxygen beneath her nose. The surgical cap they had forgotten to remove still sat crooked on her silver hair. She had gone in at 7:26 that morning. It was now past 8 in the evening. 9 hours and 34 minutes. I know the exact number because I had counted every one of them from a plastic chair in the hallway outside, staring at the same 11 floor tiles between my seat and the coffee machine, until I had memorized every crack in the grout. The nurse who finally let me in was a woman named Bonnie, broad-shouldered and warm in the way of someone who has absorbed decades of other people's worst days and still shows up. She put her hand briefly on my arm at the door and said, "She's stable, Mr. Bennett. Go on in and talk to her. They can hear you more than people think." I walked to the side of the bed and stood there for a long moment without touching Helen, afraid somehow that contact might disturb the fragile machinery keeping her with me. Then her fingers moved, slow, searching the way they do when she reaches for me in the dark. I took her hand and held it with both of mine, and the tightness in my chest that had been building since 7:26 that morning finally broke open just enough for me to breathe. "Hey, sweetheart," I said. My voice came out wrong, too rough, too low, scraped, hollow. Her eyelids fluttered. She did not open them fully, but the corners of her mouth moved. Helen Bennett has smiled at me 10,000 times in 40 years. I would know that particular movement in a pitch-black room. "Did Ryan and Melissa come?" she whispered. Her voice was barely there, thin as paper. I squeezed her hand. "They knew you were safe," I told her. "They knew." She accepted that with a small nod and drifted again, and I stood holding her hand and hating myself for the smoothness of that lie. The lie of a man who has spent a lifetime absorbing the cost of other people's choices and calling it love. After a few minutes, Bonnie appeared at my elbow with a foam cup of coffee I had not asked for. "Nobody should count floor tiles alone," she said quietly, and left before I could answer. I looked at Helen, pale, small, alive, and I took out my phone. I positioned it carefully, waiting until the light from the monitor caught her face gently rather than harshly. Her right hand, the one not threaded with IV lines, rested on the blanket with her thumb slightly raised, the way she holds it when she is thinking. I pressed the button. Then I opened the family group chat. 14 people, the full roll call, cousins and uncle, 2 of Helen's sisters, my brother-in-law Gary, who sends birthday gifts 6 days late, and at the top of the list, my son Ryan and my daughter Melissa. I typed, "She made it through surgery. She is resting. She wants to see you." I watched the screen. The small indicators showed the message was delivered, then read. One by one, the red receipts appeared. Ryan first, then Melissa, then the others in clusters. Ryan's reply came within 2 minutes. "Busy. Handle it yourself, Dad." I read that sentence 4 times. Then Melissa's response appeared beneath it, and something in my sternum went cold and quiet, the way a fire goes when the last log burns through. She made it. Stop making this our problem. I stood in that room with the monitors beeping proof of my wife's heartbeat, and I read those 2 sentences until the words stopped looking like words. 12 other people had seen them. 12 people who had shared the fundraiser, who had written, "Praying for your family," and meant it, who had eaten at our table and watched Helen cut birthday cakes for their children. Not one of them typed a single letter in response. I read every name on that silence. I memorized them the way I memorize invoice numbers, quietly, permanently, without drama. Then I did what 67 years had trained me to do. I typed, "It's okay. Take care of yourselves." But before I pressed send, I did something I had never done before. I pressed the screenshot button. The image captured everything, the timestamp, the 2 replies, the 12 names showing, read with no response below them. I saved it to a folder I had created 3 weeks earlier and labeled simply Helen. Everything. Then I sent the message, set the phone face down on the blanket beside my wife's hand, and walked to the end of the hall where the emergency stairwell door was propped open an inch. I pushed through it and let it close behind me. And in the concrete echo of that stairwell, with my fist pressed hard against my mouth so the sound would not carry back down the corridor, I cried, the way a man cries when he has been holding it for 9 hours and 34 minutes. I was 67 years old. I had run a store, raised 2 children, buried. My mother survived a recession and never once asked anyone for a thing I could not repay. And I was standing alone in a hospital stairwell in Cincinnati while my children were somewhere else entirely. Before I tell you where they were, and I will tell you every detail you need to understand what kind of man spends 35 years saying it's okay. Because that night in the stairwell was the last time I ever said it, and meant nothing by it. The next time those words came out of my mouth, there was a camera running, and my children were watching from 2 different rooms holding the pieces of 2 different phones. Let me tell you what kind of man I am, because the rest of this story will not make sense without it. Bennett's Grocery has stood on the corner of Elm and Carpenter Street in Dayton, Ohio, for 35 years. It is not a large store. 3 aisles, a deli counter that Helen ran for 20 of those years, a refrigerated section along the back wall, and a front window where I have taped hand-lettered sale signs every week since 1989. The floor is linoleum cream-colored with a pattern of faded blue diamonds. The ceiling fan above the register clicks on every 4th rotation. I have been meaning to fix it since 2019. I have not fixed it yet. I know every inch of that store the way a man knows his own hands. I know which floorboard creaks near the bread aisle, which refrigerator door seal needs an extra tug to close properly, which shelf bracket runs a 1/4 inch low and causes the soup cans to lean. I built the shelves myself in the spring of 1991 with lumber I bought on credit and paid off by Christmas. I have kept books clean since the first day we opened, every invoice filed, every receipt dated, every discrepancy investigated until it resolved. My father taught me that an honest ledger is the only thing a working man truly owns. I believed him then. I believe him still. Helen came into that store 6 months after I opened it. She was looking for a specific brand of chicken stock that nobody else in the neighborhood carried. I had ordered it on a hunch and stacked it on the second shelf from the bottom, because that is where her hands would reach without stretching. I did not know her yet. I ordered it because 3 customers had asked that week, and I listened to what my customers needed. But when she walked in and found exactly what she was looking for, she looked at me across the counter with an expression I can only describe as surprised relief, the look of someone who had stopped expecting things to work out and been proven wrong, and I thought I would like to see that expression again. We were married 14 months later. She was 24. I was 27. We have been in that store together side by side, or taking shifts for 35 of our 40 years of marriage. She handled the deli counter with the kind of warmth that made people linger longer than they intended. She remembered names without writing them down. She kept a jar of lemon drops on the counter for children who came in with their parents, and she never once made a child ask twice. The neighborhood loved Helen Bennett, the way neighborhoods love people who make ordinary life feel less lonesome. Ryan was born in 1985. Melissa 2 years after that. They grew up in the back room of that store doing homework on a folding table between deliveries, eating sandwiches Helen made from deli leftovers, learning to count change before they learned long division. I had believed for a long time that growing up inside an honest business teaches a child something permanent. Something about the relationship between work and reward, between a promise made and a promise kept. I believed that the way I believe in keeping the books clean, with my whole chest. I was wrong about at least one of those things. By the time Ryan was 30, he was selling used cars at a dealership in the northern suburbs. He was good at it. He had always known how to make a person feel chosen, feel special, feel as though the decision they were about to make was the smartest one they had ever made. He had a billboard on Route 4. His teeth looked good on it. Melissa ran a hair salon on the west side, small but busy with a social media following. She tended the way I tend my store, carefully, deliberately, with an eye for what draws people in and keeps them coming back. They were both, by any visible measure, doing fine. 6 months before Helen's diagnosis, Ryan called me on a Sunday afternoon. He needed $8,000 to cover a shortfall in his vehicle inventory. A timing issue, he said, a supplier payment that landed before a financing deal cleared. He would pay it back within 60 days. He used the word absolutely. He used the phrase, "You have my word." I had $8,000 in a savings account I had been building for 11 years, setting aside whatever the store produced above operating costs, planning for the years when my knees would finally tell me they were finished with the linoleum floor. I transferred it to Ryan the following morning. I did not ask for a written agreement. He was my son. I believed that counted for something. 60 days passed. Then 90. When I asked about the repayment, Ryan said the timing was still tight, that the market had shifted, that he appreciated my patience. I said it was okay. Because that is what I said. About everything, always. The leaking roof on the storage room. It's okay, I'll patch it this weekend. The supplier who shorted me 40 cases of tomato sauce and denied it. It's okay, I'll eat the loss. My son who borrowed $8,000 of my retirement and went quiet. It's okay. I kept the store. I kept the books. I kept saying those 2 words until they stopped meaning anything at all and became simply the sound a man makes when he has decided that keeping the peace is worth more than keeping score. In February, Helen went in for her regular cardiology checkup. She had a minor valve irregularity that we had monitored for 6 years without alarm. The appointments had become routine enough that I stayed at the store, and she drove herself the way she drives herself to get her hair cut and pick up her prescriptions, because Helen Bennett has never needed to be accompanied through ordinary life. This appointment was not ordinary. She called me from the parking garage. Her voice was steady. Helen's voice is almost always steady. It is one of the things I have loved about her for 40 years. But there was something beneath it, a new weight. The way a familiar floor sounds different when the foundation has shifted. "Walter," she said, "the doctor wants us to come back together. She said to bring you." I locked the register, flipped the sign to closed, and drove to the medical center with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. In 35 years of running that store, I had closed early exactly 4 times. This was the 4th. The cardiologist's name was Dr. Patricia Owens, and she closed the door behind her with a softness I recognized immediately. She was not the surgeon that would be a different doctor in a different city months from now. Dr. Owens was the one who told us what was coming. In 35 years of running a store, I had learned that people close doors gently when the news inside is heavy. She sat across from us with Helen's imaging results arranged on the desk between us, like a hand of cards nobody wanted to play. The valve they had been monitoring, the one we had been told, was a minor irregularity manageable watch, and weight had deteriorated faster than anyone had projected. The medical term was mitral valve regurgitation, which Dr. Owens explained means the valve is no longer closing completely between heartbeats, allowing blood to flow backward into the chamber it just left. She used calm words, measured words, the kind doctors use when they have delivered difficult news enough times to know that clarity is a form of kindness. Then she used one sentence that had no calm in it at all. "We shouldn't wait past spring," she said. "We're looking at open-heart surgery probably within the next 6 to 8 weeks. Helen reached over and took my hand under the table. Her grip was firm. Helen has always been the steadier one in a crisis. She goes quiet and focused the way a building goes still before a storm, all the energy turned inward. I was the one whose throat closed. I was the one who had to order my hand not to shake while I wrote down the name of the surgical team and the name of the hospital in Cincinnati where the procedure would be performed. I did what I always do when the ground moves beneath me. I made a list. In the parking garage afterward, I called our insurance company and stayed on hold long enough to memorize the first 8 bars of their hold music. I asked about pre-authorization out-of-pocket maximums and whether the Cincinnati facility was in-network. I wrote the answers in the same small notebook I use for inventory orders, the one with the green cover that lives in my breast pocket. Numbers steady me. Always have. Then I called Ryan. I told him his mother needed open-heart surgery. I told him the timeline. I told him I needed the $2,000 back from what I had lent him. Not all $8,000, just $2,000, enough to cover the surgical deposit the hospital required before scheduling. There was a pause on the line that lasted long enough to make me check if the call had dropped. "Dad," Ryan said finally. "I hear you. I'm going to take care of it. Just let me figure out the logistics on my end." I said that was fine. I said it was okay. I hung up and drove home and did not hear from Ryan for 11 days. What I did not know, what I could not have known, because I do not use social media, and Helen was too focused on her preoperative appointments to spend time online, was that within 48 hours of my phone call, Ryan and Melissa had built a fundraising campaign on a platform called GoFundMe. The campaign was titled "A Heart for Mom." It featured a photograph of Helen taken from her medical records, without her knowledge, her name, her diagnosis, and a fundraising goal with enough zeros to make my stomach drop when I finally saw it. The campaign text read, in part, "Our mother has been diagnosed with a serious heart condition requiring emergency open-heart surgery. As a family, we are doing everything we can to support her, but the financial burden has been overwhelming. Any contribution, no matter how small, means the world to us." Ryan and Melissa had never contributed a single dollar to Helen's medical costs. The surgical deposit had not been paid. The insurance calls had not been made. I had done all of it from the parking garage on hold with my green notebook open on the passenger seat. But the campaign made no mention of that. The campaign spoke of a family carrying an overwhelming burden together. Within a week, A Heart for Mom had raised $40,000. By the end of the second week, the total had climbed past $96,000. By the time a customer finally told me about it, the counter read $147,000, every cent of it routed to a single account. Ryan Bennett listed as organizer sole withdrawal authority. The customer who told me was Margaret Kowalski, who has been buying her groceries from me for 22 years. She came in on a Thursday morning, wrapped both her arms around me before I could say hello, and pressed her cheek against my shoulder the way people do at funerals. "Walter," she said, her voice thick. "I saw the campaign online. I donated $300 yesterday. I want you to know our whole church group gave. We love Helen so much." I stood at the counter with Margaret's arms still around me and felt something cold settle at the base of my neck. The specific cold of a number that does not add up. "What campaign?" I asked. She pulled back and looked at my face. And whatever she saw there made her own expression shift from warmth to confusion to something approaching alarm. She pulled out her phone and showed me the page. I looked at the total. I looked at Ryan's name at the top. I looked at the photograph of my wife taken without her permission. Then I walked to the register computer, typed the campaign name into the browser, and sat with what I found. $147,000. My Nora Collins, who has worked the register at Bennett's for 22 years and knows this store as well as I do, came to stand beside me without a word. She looked at the screen. She looked at my face. Then she put her hand on my arm, the same way Bonnie the nurse would do months later in a Cincinnati hospital, and she said quietly, "Walter, what do you need me to do?" I stared at that number for a long time. Then I opened the drawer beneath the register, took out a fresh manila folder, and wrote 2 words on the tab in blue ink. Helen. Everything. I called Ryan that same evening. Not from anger. I have never been a man who acts from anger, because anger is an expense I learned early I could not afford. I called him the way I call a supplier when an invoice does not match the delivery directly, specifically, without room for misunderstanding. "I saw the campaign," I said when he picked up. $147,000, Ryan, in your name, with your mother's medical photograph. Nobody asked us. There was a pause. Then Ryan laughed. Not the embarrassed laugh of someone caught doing something wrong, but the loose, easy laugh of someone who has never once considered that the rules apply to him the same way they apply to everyone else. "Dad, relax," he said. "This is a good thing. People want to help. We're giving them a way to help. That's all this is." "Transfer the campaign to my name," I said. "I am Helen's husband and her next of kin. The hospital needs a deposit by the end of the week. Transfer it tonight, and I will handle the rest." "I can't do that right now," Ryan said. "There's a process. There are logistics. Just trust me, Dad. I've got this handled." He hung up before I could respond. I stood in the back room of the store with the phone in my hand and the green notebook open on the shelf beside me, and I wrote down the time, the date, and the exact words he had used. "Trust me. I've got this handled." I wrote them down because I have kept records for 35 years, and I know that the sentences people use when they are not planning to keep their word have a particular shape. They are long on reassurance and short on specifics. They end with the other person's name or with a phrase designed to close the conversation rather than answer the question. 3 days later, Ryan arrived at the store. He did not come alone. He pulled up in his truck with a man I did not recognize in the passenger seat, carrying a camera bag, And from the back seat, Ryan lifted out a piece of foam board nearly 4 feet wide, a novelty check, the kind used at charity events and award ceremonies, printed with the number $2,000 in large black figures and Ryan Bennett written in the memo line. He came through the front door, grinning, the check tucked under one arm, the photographer following 2 steps behind. "Dad," he said, spreading his arms wide as though he had just returned from a long journey. "We're doing a little morale boost for Mom. Something to show her the family is rallying. I need you to hold this with me for a couple of photos. Something positive for the campaign page." I looked at the check. I looked at the photographer adjusting his lens by the bread aisle. I looked at my son's face, open, warm, the same face that had sold 14 cars last month, according to the dealership's Facebook page, and I felt the cold spot at the base of my neck again. The same one from Margaret's visit. The specific cold of arithmetic that is being performed behind a smile. But I took the check. Because he was my son. Because Helen was 3 weeks from surgery. Because I was 67 years old, and I had spent those years choosing peace over confrontation, and I did not yet understand what that choice had been costing me, compounded daily for decades. I held the foam board beside Ryan. The photographer took 6 shots. Ryan put his arm around my shoulder and said, "Big smile, Dad. This is a good day." I smiled. The camera clicked. Ryan stepped back, took the novelty check from my hands and slid it into the bed of his truck before I had fully processed that he was leaving. "I'll get that deposit transferred by end of week," he said through the window as he backed out. "Tell Mom we love her." The photographer got back in the truck. They drove away. I stood on the sidewalk in front of Bennett's and watched the truck until it turned the corner and disappeared. Then I went inside behind the counter, and I opened the laptop and navigated to the campaign page. Ryan had posted the photographs within the hour. The caption read, "First disbursement from a devoted son to his proud father. Our family stands together. Link in bio to contribute." The comments filled with hearts and praying hands within minutes. The donation counter climbed another $4,000 before I closed the browser. 3 days after that, $2,000 arrived in my bank account. I checked the transfer origin. It came from an account I did not recognize, not Ryan's personal checking, not any account I had seen before. I would learn later, when Nora helped me trace the routing numbers, that the account was a secondary holding account linked directly to the campaign funds. Ryan had not paid me back a single dollar of his own money. He had taken $2,000 of the community's donations, handed it to me with a novelty check and a photographer, and posted the evidence online as proof of his generosity. Meanwhile, the $8,000 I had transferred from my retirement savings 11 months earlier had not been mentioned once. I sat at the register that evening after Nora went home, the store dark except for the light above the counter, and I opened the manila folder. I printed the campaign page. I printed the bank transfer confirmation. I printed a screenshot of the social media post with its caption and its comment section, full of people praising my son's devotion. I paperclipped them together in chronological order and placed them in the folder behind the tab I had labeled in blue ink 3 days earlier. Then I printed one more thing. The photograph of my wife, pale blue hospital gown medical equipment visible at the edges that Ryan had posted, without asking her. Without asking me. Without asking anyone. I held it for a moment. Then I filed it at the front of the folder first page where I would see it every time I opened the cover. The morning of April 14th, I woke at 4:45 without an alarm. I lay in the dark for a few minutes, listening to Helen breathe beside me, the slow, even rhythm of someone who has made peace with what the day holds. She had been quieter than usual the past week, not withdrawn, just turned inward the way she gets when she is organizing herself for something difficult. She had ironed her going to the hospital clothes the night before and laid them across the chair by the window. She had watered her plants. She had written a list of instructions for me about the houseplants, which ones needed more light, which ones were particular about watering schedules. The list was written on the back of an envelope and left on the kitchen counter where I would see it. I made coffee for both of us, and we sat at the kitchen table in the dark and drank it without turning on the light. 40 years of mornings had given us a language that did not require words, and that morning we used it entirely. Ryan had texted the night before. "Important business meeting, can't make it. We'll be thinking of you both." Melissa's message came 20 minutes later. Different words, identical meaning. I read them at the kitchen table and said nothing to Helen about them. I told her Ryan sent his love. I told her Melissa was praying for her. Helen nodded and wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and looked out the window at the dark yard, and I could not tell whether she believed me. We arrived at the hospital at 6:15. The surgical team was efficient and kind in the way of people who do this every day and have not lost the understanding of what it means to the people who do not. A nurse helped Helen into a gown and explained the procedure in plain language. An anesthesiologist came in and introduced himself and shook Helen's hand and then mine. Helen asked him one question. She asked whether she would dream. He smiled and told her most people do not, but some do, and the ones who do usually dream about something peaceful. Helen said that was fine then. She said she had plenty of peaceful things to dream about. They wheeled her back at 7:26. She reached up and took my hand one last time as the gurney moved, and I walked beside her until the corridor doors required me to stop. She looked back once. I raised my hand. The doors swung shut. I found the chair the admissions nurse had pointed me toward a row of seats along the window in the surgical waiting area, institutional gray upholstery, the kind built for endurance rather than comfort. I sat down. I took out my green notebook. I wrote down the time, 7:26. Then I counted the floor tiles. 11 tiles from my chair to the coffee machine along the far wall. The grout between them was the color of old cream. 3 tiles had small chips at the corners. The middle section had been replaced at some point, newer tiles, slightly brighter than the originals. The difference visible only if you were looking for it, only if you had nothing else to look at. And 9 hours in front of you and the person you love most in the world behind a set of doors you cannot open. A nurse named Bonnie brought me coffee at noon without being asked. She set it on the chair beside me and said, "Any questions, you find me." That was all. It was enough. Around 2 in the afternoon, I picked up my phone to check for any update from the surgical team. My thumb landed on the notification bar instead, and I saw Ryan's name attached to a live video post. I pressed it without thinking. The screen filled with a ballroom. String lights draped across a ceiling 20 feet high. Round tables covered in white linen centerpieces with tall white flowers I could not name. 300 people in formal dress, the low roar of a crowd in good spirits, the clink of glassware. A banner along the back wall read, "A Heart for Mom" in script. Letters 3 feet tall, and behind the banner repeated 6 times across its width, was a photograph of Helen, my wife. In the blue dress she wore to our nephew's wedding 4 years ago, smiling the way she smiles when someone has said something that genuinely delighted her. Ryan stood at a podium in a charcoal suit with a burgundy tie. Melissa sat at the head table in a floor-length navy dress, a satin sash draped across her shoulder that read, "Save Our Mom" in gold letters. She was laughing at something the person beside her had said. Her head was thrown back. She looked spectacular and completely at ease. My phone told me it was 2:17 in the afternoon. Helen had been in surgery for 6 hours and 51 minutes. Ryan tapped the microphone and the room settled. He spoke about family. He spoke about sacrifice and community and the meaning of showing up for the people you love. His voice carried the practiced warmth of a man who sells things for a living and knows exactly how much eye contact to make. Then he raised a glass toward the banner and announced that the A Heart for Mom campaign was proud to pledge $20,000 to the cardiac unit at Cincinnati Children's Medical Center in Helen's honor. The ballroom stood up, all 300 people rising together, the applause filling the phone speaker with distortion. Melissa pressed her hand to her chest and closed her eyes. Ryan smiled the smile from the Route 4 billboard. Behind them, both Helen's photograph smiled its genuine, unknowing smile at a room full of strangers celebrating her open chest. I turned off the phone. I put it face down on the chair beside me. I picked up the foam cup of coffee Bonnie had brought and held it in both hands, the way Helen holds her coffee mug in the mornings. And I sat with what I had just seen until the feeling of it settled into something I could carry without dropping. Then I counted the floor tiles again. 11. The same 11. Still there. At 4:10, the corridor doors opened. Dr. Callahan was still in her scrub cap when she came through the doors, and I was on my feet before she had taken 3 steps into the waiting area. I had been sitting for 8 hours and 44 minutes, and my knees protested the sudden movement, but I did not feel it. I was watching her face. In my experience, a person's face in the first 2 seconds before they have composed themselves tells you everything the words are going to confirm or deny. Dr. Callahan's face in those 2 seconds was tired and focused, and carrying the specific quiet of someone who has just finished something difficult and done it well. "Mr. Bennett," she said. "The surgery was successful. The valve repair held. Her numbers are strong." I heard the word successful, and my legs did something unreliable beneath me. I grabbed the back of the nearest chair with both hands and held on, and Dr. Callahan put her hand on my forearm and steadied me with the practiced calm of someone who has caught people at this exact moment before. "She's in recovery," she said. "You'll be able to see her within the hour. She came through beautifully, Mr. Bennett. She is a strong woman." I said thank you. I said it 3 times. I am not certain what else I said. I sat back down in the gray chair and put my face in my hands and breathed the way you breathe when you have been holding your breath for 9 hours without realizing it, in great shaking pulls that have nowhere near enough dignity for a 67-year-old man in a public waiting room. I did not care. Bonnie appeared from somewhere and put her hand on my back and left it there until I had steadied, and she did not say a word, which was exactly right. They brought me to Helen at 8:31 that evening, the pediatric cardiac ICU, because Cincinnati's program for adult valve repair, operated within the same specialized unit, was quieter than I expected and colder than was comfortable. The lighting was low and deliberate. Helen was in the 3rd bay from the entrance behind a glass partition, and I could see her before the nurse opened the door, which meant I had approximately 4 seconds to arrange my face into something that would not frighten her. She was the color of the sheet beneath her. There were lids taped to her chest, connecting her to a monitor that tracked her heartbeat in a green line across a dark screen. An IV ran into her left arm. An oxygen cannula sat beneath her nose. The surgical cap was still on, slightly crooked. She looked smaller than she had that morning, which I know is not medically possible but is emotionally true in a way I cannot explain otherwise. I pulled the chair close and sat and took her hand very carefully, avoiding the IV line, holding just her fingers, the way you hold something you are afraid of disturbing. Her eyelids moved, then opened partway, unfocused at first, and then finding me with the slow deliberateness of someone navigating back from a long distance. "Walter." Her voice was barely there. rough from the breathing tube they had removed an hour earlier, thin as tissue paper. "Right here," I said. "I'm right here, sweetheart. You did it." Dr. Callahan said the repair held perfectly. Helen's mouth moved. She was trying to form a word, and the effort of it tightened something behind my sternum. I leaned closer. "Did they come?" she whispered. I looked at my wife's face, pale open, asking the one question she had saved up through 9 hours of anesthesia, and I made a decision in approximately 1 second that I have thought about every day since. "They knew you were safe," I told her. "They've been thinking about you all day." Helen closed her eyes again. A small nod. She accepted it the way she accepts most things I tell her, with the particular trust of someone who has had 40 years of reasons to believe me, and who did not deserve in that moment to be handed the truth, along with the anesthesia and the chest tubes and the green line on the dark screen. I sat with her until her breathing deepened and evened into sleep. Then I took out my phone. 14 people in the family group chat. I typed carefully the way I type everything, deliberately checking each word before I moved to the next. "She made it through surgery. She is resting. She wants to see you." I watched the screen. The read receipts appeared one by one, Ryan's first, then Melissa's, then the cluster of cousins and aunts, and my brother-in-law, Gary, who sends birthday gifts 6 days late. 14 people. 14 red confirmations. I counted them the way I had counted the floor tiles. The same patient necessary counting of a man with nothing to do but wait. Ryan's reply arrived first. "Busy. Handle it yourself, Dad." Then Melissa 30 seconds behind him. "She made it. Stop turning this into our problem." I read both messages 4 times. Then I read the names below them, 12 people who had seen those words land in that chat, and chosen each of them individually to say nothing. 12 separate decisions to be absent. I memorized every name with the same quiet permanence I use for invoice numbers that do not add up. I typed, "It's okay. Take care of yourselves." Before I pressed send, I pressed screenshot. I saved it to the folder on my phone labeled Helen. Everything. Then I sent the message, set the phone face down on the blanket beside my wife's hand, and walked to the emergency stairwell at the end of the corridor. The door closed behind me. The concrete walls were cold, and the fluorescent light above buzzed faintly. I pressed my back against the wall, slid down until I was sitting on the top step, put my fist against my mouth, and cried. Hard silence, the kind that shakes your whole frame. My wife had just survived open-heart surgery. My children had just told me to handle it myself. And somewhere across town, 300 people were finishing their dessert course under string lights, applauding the devotion of a family that did not exist. I sat in that stairwell for 11 minutes. Then I stood up, straightened my shirt, and walked back to my wife's bedside. She was still asleep. The green line moved steadily across the dark screen. I sat down beside her and held her hand and did not let go until morning. We came home 5 days later. Helen walked through the front door of our house on Carpenter Street, slowly, one hand on my arm, the other trailing along the wall, the way she does when she is finding her footing after something large. The doctors had given her a list of restrictions: no lifting above 5 pounds for 6 weeks, no driving for 4 cardiac rehabilitation appointments every Tuesday and Thursday at the medical center on Salem Road. I had written everything down in the green notebook and transferred it to a wall calendar in the kitchen, each appointment in blue ink, each medication time in red. I had done the same thing for our store accounts for 35 years. Systems work. Systems are what you build when you cannot control the thing itself. Helen sat in her chair by the living room window, the wingback one with the faded yellow upholstery that she has refused to reupholster for 15 years because she likes the way it has shaped itself to her. And she looked out at the yard and said, "The tulips came up while I was gone." She said it the way you say something when you need to say something ordinary, when the ordinary is the only thing standing between you and the size of what just happened. "They did," I said. "Red ones this year. More than last year." She nodded and closed her eyes, and I went to the kitchen and started a list. Hospitals bill in stages, the way weather moves through one system followed by another before the ground has dried from the first. The surgical facility sent its statement within a week of discharge. The anesthesiology group billed separately, as they always do, a detail our insurance company had mentioned on hold in the parking garage 2 months earlier, and which I had written down and was therefore not surprised by. The Cardiac Rehabilitation Center sent a benefits summary. I itemized everything on a spreadsheet: dates, providers, amounts, billed amounts, covered by insurance amounts remaining. I added the gas for 6 trips to Cincinnati, the 2 nights in a hotel near the hospital, when I had been too exhausted to drive home safely. The 2 weeks I had closed the store or reduced hours, the lost revenue calculated conservatively against our average weekly receipts. The total came to $14,230. I am an accountant by habit, if not by training. I know what numbers mean, and I know what the distance between 2 numbers means. The campaign sat at $147,000 on its public page. The amount Helen's household had received from that campaign was $4,000, the 2 payments of $2,000 each, both sourced from campaign funds rather than Ryan's personal account, both posted online as demonstrations of filial devotion. The distance between $147,000 and $4,000 is $143,000. I did not need a calculator. I needed a reason. I wrote to Ryan formally, not a text, not a phone call, a written message sent by email with a red receipt, requested the way you communicate when you intend to keep a record. I attached the spreadsheet. I explained the total. I asked him to transfer funds from the campaign to cover Helen's actual medical costs as her husband and legal next of kin, which under Ohio law gave me standing to request accounting of funds raised in her name. I used complete sentences. I used correct punctuation. I copied Melissa. 3 days of silence followed. I opened the store each morning, kept the books, restocked the shelves, and did not call either of them. Nora watched me from the register the way she has watched me navigate difficult inventory situations for 22 years, saying nothing, staying close ready. On the 4th day, a bank transfer arrived. $2,000. The memo line contained a single word: final. I sat with that word for a long time. Final. One word doing the work of a sentence, the sentence being this conversation is over, this obligation is discharged. Do not contact us again about this matter. I had seen that kind of memo before in business disputes, when one party decides unilaterally that the ledger is closed. It is a technique. It only works if the other party agrees that the ledger is closed. I called Ryan. He picked up on the second ring, which surprised me. I had expected voicemail. "Dad." His voice was smooth, prepared. He had been expecting the call. $2,000, I said. With a memo that says final. "Ryan, your mother's medical costs are $14,000. The campaign raised $147,000. Explain the math to me." "The remaining funds have been allocated," he said. The phrasing was careful: allocated, not spent, not used. Allocated. A word that implies intention and planning rather than expenditure already made. Melissa and I have been working on something bigger than one set of hospital bills, something that honors Mom properly. "What does that mean?" I asked. "Helen's Heart Project," he said. "A foundation in Mom's name. We're setting it up to help other families facing cardiac emergencies. It's what the donors gave for Dad. It's bigger than just us." The line was quiet for a moment. I was looking at the spreadsheet on my kitchen table at the column of numbers that represented what the surgery had cost the woman, currently sitting in a faded yellow wingback chair 30 feet away, learning to breathe at full capacity again. "Who authorized that?" I asked. "Who gave you permission to use your mother's name for a foundation?" "It's a family decision," Ryan said. "She is my wife," I said. "I am her husband. You are her son." "Those are not the same thing in the eyes of the law, Ryan, and you know it." He said he had a customer waiting. He said we would talk more when things settled down. He hung up. I set the phone on the kitchen table beside the spreadsheet and the folder and the green notebook. Helen called from the living room asking if I wanted tea. I said yes. I listened to her move carefully around the kitchen, the slow, deliberate steps of someone relearning the ordinary choreography of a day, and I opened the folder and added a new tab. I labeled it in block letters, Helen's Heart Project. Then I picked up the phone and called Nora and asked her to pull every invoice from the past 3 months that had come in under the store's billing address. Her pause lasted exactly 2 seconds. "How far back do you want me to go?" she asked. "All of it," I said. "Everything since February." Nora had been at the store since 5:30 in the morning. I arrived at 6 an hour before we opened and found her at the back table with 3 stacks of paper arranged in front of her and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow. She had pulled every invoice filed under the store's billing address since February. Suppliers, utilities, service contractors, everything, and sorted them into 3 categories. She had used paper clips and sticky notes color-coded in the way she has organized the store's filing system for 22 years, red for confirmed legitimate yellow, for unclear green, for what she called in the neat handwriting she uses for everything does not belong here. The green stack was the tallest. "Sit down, Walter," she said. Not a suggestion. Nora Collins does not make suggestions when the situation requires something more direct. I sat. She walked me through it the way a person walks someone through a diagnosis methodically, without editorializing, giving me the facts in the order they needed to land. The first document was an invoice for a $2,400 truck payment. The billing name at the top was Bennett's Grocery. The account number was the store's. The payment had been drawn from a secondary account linked to the campaign funds. The truck in question was a 2023 Ford F-150 registered in Ryan Bennett's name, purchased in March 6 weeks before Helen's surgery. "Ryan's truck," I said. "Ryan's truck," Nora confirmed. The second document was a contractor invoice for $8,600 in salon renovation. New wash stations, updated lighting, a front counter replacement. Billed to Bennett's Grocery. Paid from campaign funds. The salon address on this work order was Melissa's West Side location. The third document was a resort invoice. 3 nights at a lakeside property in northern Ohio, 2 guests both surnamed Bennett. Meals included. The booking category listed on the expense report was Strategic Planning Retreat. The dates corresponded to the 2nd week of May, 3 weeks after Helen's surgery, while Helen was still attending twice-weekly cardiac rehabilitation, and I was driving her there and back and opening the store in between. I picked up each document and set it back down. I did this slowly, the way you handle something you want to make sure you have understood correctly before you respond to it. "There's more," Nora said. The inventory records showed 4 separate entries between March and June, marked Donated Goods Charitable Distribution. Combined value $11,300. Canned goods, dry staples, household supplies, all logged as outgoing charitable contributions, which under the store's accounting would reduce taxable inventory and justify cash withdrawals from the operating account. I had not authorized any charitable distributions. I had not signed any of the corresponding withdrawal forms. The signature on each form was a passable imitation of mine, close enough to pass a casual review, not close enough to pass a careful one. I looked at Nora. She looked back at me with the expression of a woman who has been sitting with this information since 5:30 in the morning and has had time to feel everything she needed to feel about it before I arrived. "How did you find it?" I asked. "Hyundai, sir. The inventory numbers stopped reconciling in March," she said. "I thought it was a data entry error at first. I went back through manually. Every discrepancy connected to one of those distribution entries." She paused. "I should have caught it sooner." "You caught it," I said. "That's what matters." My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Tommy Bach, the delivery driver who had been running product to the store for 8 years and who had never once been late and never once shorted me on account. Tommy was 20 words into a message before I registered what I was looking at. "Mr. Bennett. Thought you should see this. Took the photo this morning on my route. I'm sorry." Below the text was a photograph taken from a sidewalk. A bus bench at the corner of 5th and Linden, 3 blocks from the store. The bench advertisement showed Helen's face, the same photograph from the campaign page, cropped and color-corrected, printed at roughly 18 by 24 inches. Beside her image was the logo of Helen's Heart Project in navy and gold. And beside that, in the same navy and gold, the logo of Ryan's car dealership and the logo of Melissa's salon, sharing the same color palette, the same font family, the same graphic style. A matched set. My wife's face on a bus bench flanked by her children's business brands, generating goodwill and foot traffic for enterprises that had paid for the advertising with money strangers had donated to keep her alive. I sat with that photograph for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the front window of the store. The same light that has come through that window for 35 years, landing on the same cream linoleum with the blue diamond pattern, and I felt something shift inside me the way a heavy piece of furniture shifts when you have finally decided to move it. The grinding resistance first, then the sudden give, then the strange lightness of the space it leaves behind. I picked up the folder. I added the ghost invoices behind the campaign screenshots. I added Tommy's photograph behind the invoices. I sat back in my chair and looked at what I had assembled: dates, amounts, documents, a photograph of my wife's face selling car dealerships from a street corner, and I understood something that changed the temperature of everything that came before it. Until that morning, I had been telling myself that Ryan and Melissa were greedy. Greedy people can be confronted. Greedy people, when the evidence is clear enough, will sometimes choose to pay rather than be exposed. What I was looking at was not greed dressed up in paperwork. It was a system, built deliberately over months using my store's name and my wife's face and the goodwill of an entire community as raw materials. Systems require a different response than greed does. I closed the folder. I looked at Nora. "I need you to make copies of everything," I said. 2 sets. One stays here, one comes home with me tonight. Nora nodded once and reached for the first stack. Her hands were steady. Mine were not. The notice arrived in the store's mail on a Thursday morning in late May, tucked between a utility bill and a produce supplier catalog. It was a standard business filing acknowledgement from the Ohio Secretary of State's office, the kind of document that confirms a trade name registration has been processed and accepted. In Ohio, registering a trade name costs $50 and requires a single form submitted online or by mail. The process takes approximately 2 weeks. You do not need the consent of anyone whose name you are using, provided the name does not infringe on an existing registered trademark. I know this because I looked it up sitting at the register counter with the notice in my hand, before I allowed myself to react to what I was reading. The registered trade name was Bennett Family Fund. The registrant was Ryan James Bennett. The registration date was March 19th, 5 weeks before Helen's surgery, 3 weeks after I had told Ryan she needed open-heart surgery, 1 week after the campaign had passed $50,000. I set the notice on the counter and looked at it for a long time. The name I had built for 35 years. The name above the door. The name on the invoices. The name my customers trusted when they handed over their money for groceries and received honest weight and fair price in return, had been filed as a commercial asset by my son for $50 without a conversation, without a question, without the courtesy of a phone call. I added the notice to the folder. 2 days later, Melissa came to the store. She arrived at 11 in the morning, between the breakfast rush and the lunch crowd, which I recognized as deliberate timing enough customers present to make a scene uncomfortable few enough that the conversation could be managed. She was dressed carefully the way she dresses when she wants to be taken seriously rather than liked, and she was carrying a manila envelope thick enough to suggest it had been prepared by someone who charged by the page. She set it on the counter between us and smiled the smile she has used since she was 9 years old to signal that she has already decided how the conversation ends. "Dad," she said, "we need to talk about the store." I did not touch the envelope. "Talk," I said. She had prepared a presentation. I recognized it as a presentation because she used the word vision 3 times in the first 2 minutes and referenced community impact twice without specifying what impact or for whom. The proposal she explained was for me to sign over management of the store to her and Ryan, who would convert it into a community hub operating under the Helen's Heart Project umbrella. I would retain a ceremonial role. I would be listed on the website as founder. I would not be required to work. I would, she said, with the specific warmth of someone delivering a verdict, disguised as a gift, finally be able to rest. I picked up the envelope and opened it. The document inside was 41 pages. I am a man who reads contracts because I have signed enough of them to know that the meaning of any agreement lives in the sections printed in the smallest font on the pages closest to the back. I flipped to page 38, then page 39. Then I read the definition clause on page 4 that changed the meaning of every page between them. The transfer was not of store management. The transfer was of ownership full and irrevocable covering the store property, the business license, the associated real estate, and all accounts held under the Bennett's grocery trade name. The consideration offered in exchange, meaning what I would receive in return for signing, was listed in Section 12, subsection C, in a font I had to hold the paper closer to read. $0. No monetary consideration. The transfer was to be made as a gift. I looked up from this document. Melissa was watching me with the patient expression of someone who has made this offer before and knows which people eventually say yes. "Sign it," she said. "And all of this unpleasantness ends. You get to focus on Mom. We handle the business side. Everyone gets what they need." I set the document back in the envelope. I set the envelope on the counter between us and pressed it flat with the palm of my hand. The way you press something you want to be certain is going back in the direction it came from. "No," I said. Her patient expression did not change, which told me she had prepared for this answer. "Dad, you're not thinking clearly. You've been under enormous stress. Ryan and I are just trying to help. You registered my family's name as a commercial asset in March," I said, "without asking me. You built a foundation using your mother's face without asking her. You have invoiced this store for your personal expenses and drawn cash against charitable donations made by this community in your mother's name. And now you have brought me a contract that transfers everything I own to you in exchange for nothing." I tapped the envelope once. I am thinking very clearly. Something moved behind Melissa's eyes. Not guilt, not shame, but the specific recalculation of a person who has encountered an obstacle they had not adequately planned for. She picked up the envelope. She smoothed the front of her jacket with her free hand. "You'll regret this," she said. Her voice had lost the warmth entirely. What was underneath it was harder and flatter and considerably more honest. "We're trying to do something good here. You're making it difficult." She left without waiting for a response. I stood at the counter and listened to the bell above the door settle after she had gone, and then I went to the back room and called Helen. She picked up on the second ring. "How was your morning?" she asked. "Quiet," I said. "How are you feeling?" "Better today," she said. I walked to the end of the block and back. "First time since we got home." I closed my eyes. "That's good, sweetheart," I said. "That's really good." I did not tell her about the envelope. I hung up and opened the folder and added a new tab labeled in the same block letters I had been using since the beginning. I wrote "Transfer Agreement Refused." Helen's first follow-up appointment at the Cincinnati Cardiac Center was on a Tuesday morning in early June, 6 weeks after surgery. She dressed herself that morning without help for the first time, slowly, carefully, with the particular concentration of someone who has had to relearn the sequence of ordinary things, and when she came to the kitchen table for coffee, she was wearing the blue cardigan she keeps for doctor's appointments and her good shoes, and she had done her hair. I did not say anything about it. I just poured her coffee and set it where she could reach it, and pretended I was reading the supply list on the counter so she would not see my face. The drive to Cincinnati was an hour and 40 minutes. Helen slept for the first 40 and watched the highway for the rest. Her hands folded in her lap, her profile against the window, familiar enough that I could have drawn it from memory in the dark. We have made this drive together many times over the past year, and it has developed its own quiet rhythm, the specific companionship of two people who have run out of things to be afraid of and have decided, without discussing it, to simply be present instead. Dr. Callahan's team reviewed Helen's imaging and confirmed what her color and her steadier breathing had already suggested. The repair was holding the valve. Function had improved to within acceptable range. The next milestone would be a 6-month echo in October. Helen asked 3 questions, wrote the answers in the small spiral notebook she brings to every appointment, and thanked the nurse by name on the way out. That is Helen. That has always been Helen. In the corridor outside the cardiology suite, a woman stopped us. She was perhaps 45, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the lanyard of a hospital employee visible beneath her jacket. She introduced herself as Emily Harper, Patient Services Coordinator for the Cardiac Unit. She said she had been hoping to connect with us and asked if we had a few minutes. Her tone had the careful calibration of someone who is about to say something she is not entirely certain she should say, but has decided that not saying it would be worse. We sat in a small family consultation room off the main corridor. 2 chairs and a round table and a box of tissues nobody touched. Emily set a folder on the table and folded her hands over it. "I want to ask about the foundation," she said. "Helen's Heart Project, specifically about the pledge that was announced at the fundraising event in April." I looked at her. "The $20,000 pledge," I said. Emily nodded. "It was announced publicly at the event from the podium. One of our development staff members saw the live stream and shared it internally. The pledge was made in your wife's name to this unit specifically to support families facing cardiac emergencies." She paused. "We have not received anything. Not a check, not a transfer confirmation, not a pledge agreement form. Nothing." I sat with that for a moment. Outside the consultation room window, the hospital corridor moved at its ordinary pace. Nurses, visitors, the particular purposeful quiet of a place where the stakes are always high. I thought about Ryan at the podium under the string lights, his glass raised 300 people on their feet. I thought about the applause coming through my phone speaker in the surgical waiting area while I counted floor tiles, and my wife's chest was open on a table 90 minutes away. "How long have you been waiting?" I asked. "Since April," Emily said. We followed up twice by phone and once by email with the contact information listed on the Foundation's website. We received one response acknowledging receipt of our inquiry. Nothing further. I asked her to confirm what she had just told me in writing. Not because I doubted her, I did not doubt her, but because I had learned over the preceding weeks that the difference between what people say and what can be proven is the only distance that matters when you are assembling a record. Emily understood immediately. She said she would send a written confirmation to my email address within 24 hours, and that her department head had already been made aware of the situation. I thanked her. Helen thanked her. We shook hands and walked back to the parking garage in the June heat, and I waited until we were in the car with the doors closed before I said anything. "Did you hear all of that?" I asked. Helen was looking straight ahead through the windshield at the concrete pillar in front of us. "Yes," she said. Her voice was even, controlled in the way of someone who has been controlling something for a while and has gotten very good at it. "Helen, well, I heard it, Walter." She turned to look at me then, and what was on her face was not surprise. That was the thing that stayed with me on the drive home, and for many days after, she was not surprised. She was tired in a way that had nothing to do with surgery or recovery. The bone-deep tiredness of a woman who has been trying not to know something for a long time and has finally run out of reasons to keep trying. "Just drive," she said. "Please." I drove. She watched the highway the whole way back. When we pulled into the driveway on Carpenter Street, she got out of the car and went inside without waiting for me, and I sat in the parked car for a few minutes with my hands on the wheel and the engine off. Then I took out the green notebook and wrote down everything Emily Harper had told us. The dates of the follow-up attempts, the single response acknowledging receipt, the total amount pledged, and the total amount received. I wrote it in the same small, even handwriting I use for inventory numbers, because numbers are what they were and numbers do not lie. And the space between a public pledge of $20,000 and $0 received is not a miscommunication or an administrative oversight. It is a decision. That evening after Helen was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with the folder open and added Emily's information behind the ghost invoices and the bus bench photograph and the refused transfer agreement. Then I picked up my phone and searched for a name I had been avoiding for several weeks. Claire Dawson, Channel 7. The reporter who had sat Ryan and Melissa in front of a camera in March in a segment called Community Heroes and broadcast their story to every household in Dayton. I found her email address on the station's website. I opened a new message. I looked at it for a long time without typing. Then I started with the only sentence that seemed honest. "My name is Walter Bennett," I wrote. "I believe you may have made a mistake, and I think you deserve the chance to correct it." Claire Dawson called me back on a Monday morning before I had finished my first cup of coffee. I had sent the email on a Sunday evening and had told myself not to expect a response before Wednesday at the earliest, because that is the reasonable expectation when you send an unsolicited message to a television reporter at a regional news station. Claire Dawson was apparently not interested in reasonable expectations. She said she had read my email 3 times. She said she wanted to meet in person. She said she could be available Tuesday afternoon if I could come to the station. I said I could. The week that followed moved at 2 speeds, simultaneously. The ordinary speed of the store, the register, the invoices, the Tuesday and Thursday drives to Helen's cardiac rehabilitation, and beneath that, a second speed entirely faster and quieter, the speed at which a decision that has been building for months begins to approach the moment when it becomes irreversible. I had been assembling the folder for weeks. I had been telling myself I was gathering information. What I had actually been doing, I understood that week, was building a shelter and deciding whether I was brave enough to use it. On Thursday morning, I left my phone on the kitchen counter and went out to the backyard to check on the tomato plants Helen had asked me to water while she was still moving carefully through the house. I was out there for perhaps 12 minutes. When I came back inside, Helen was sitting at the kitchen table with my phone face down in front of her and her hands folded on top of it, and the expression on her face was the one I have seen exactly twice in 40 years of marriage, the expression she wore when her mother died in 2008, and the expression she wore in the surgical waiting room when they told us Grace, our niece, had been in a car accident. The expression of a woman who has absorbed something large and has not yet decided what to do with it. "Helen," I said. She looked up. Her eyes were dry, which somehow made it worse. Helen cries easily and without embarrassment at films, at hymns, at the particular quality of late afternoon light in October. The fact that she was not crying told me that what she had absorbed was beyond the register that produces tears. "Melissa called," she said. "I picked up because I thought it was you." I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "What did she say?" Helen looked at the phone between her hands for a moment. Then she told me in the careful, sequential way she tells me things when she wants to make certain I understand every part of it. Melissa had been talking to someone else, a voice Helen did not recognize. A man speaking in the tone of someone working through logistics rather than having a conversation. Melissa had not known her mother was on the line. The part of the conversation Helen had heard lasted approximately 90 seconds. In those 90 seconds, Melissa had said 3 things that Helen repeated to me word for word, the way you repeat something you have been holding in your mouth carefully to make sure you do not drop any of it. First, the old man needs to sign the papers before the station airs anything or the whole thing falls apart. Second, if he won't sign, we work on Mom. She'll do whatever he asks her to do. We just have to get to her first. Third, Ryan needs to stop panicking. Ryan panicking is the only thing that can actually hurt us right now. I sat with those 3 sentences. Outside the kitchen window, the tomato plants were doing what tomato plants do in June in Ohio, growing steadily, indifferently, entirely unconcerned with the things that happen in the kitchens beside them. Helen unfolded her hands and pushed the phone across the table toward me. "I didn't say anything," she said. She didn't know I was there. I listened until she moved to another room and the voice got too faint to hear, and then I hung up. "Helen, I want to see the folder," she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely certain, the voice she uses when she has finished deliberating and there is nothing left to discuss. In 40 years, I have learned to recognize that voice. In 40 years, I have never successfully argued with it. I got up and retrieved the folder from the locked drawer in the home office where I had been keeping it 3 inches thick. Now every tab labeled, every document dated and organized in the order I would need them if I ever had to walk someone through the whole of it from the beginning. I set it on the table in front of her. She opened it. She read slowly, turning each page with the same deliberateness she brings to everything that matters. She did not speak for 22 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the microwave and did not look away from it, because looking at her face while she read was more than I could manage. When she finished, she closed the cover and rested her hand on top of it. Her palm was flat against the folder, the way you press your hand against something to confirm it is real. "How long have you been carrying this alone?" she asked. "Since April," I said. She looked at me across the kitchen table, across 40 years of mornings and Tuesday drives and tomato plants, and the particular exhausted love of 2 people who have chosen each other so many times. It has stopped being a choice and become simply the shape of their lives. Her eyes filled then, finally, and she pressed her lips together hard. "You should have told me," she said. "You were recovering." "I was recovering," she said, "not disappearing." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, one quick, decisive motion, Helen's style, no lingering. Then she straightened in her chair and pulled the folder toward her side of the table. "Call Claire Dawson," she said. "Tell her we are ready." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. Her fingers turned and gripped mine back with a strength that had been absent for weeks, the grip of someone who has found solid ground again after a long time of uncertain footing. That afternoon I called Claire. Tuesday evening I sat across from her in a Channel 7 conference room with the folder on the table between us, and Helen sat beside me for the first time in this story as something other than a patient. She sat as a witness. She sat as a woman who had heard her daughter describe her as a tool to be used and had decided quietly and completely that she was done being quiet about it. Claire Dawson had a corner desk at Channel 7 and a segment called Follow the Money that had spent 3 years chasing contractors who vanished with deck deposits and landlords who pocketed security fees and never fixed the furnace. She was waiting for us in a conference room on the second floor, a long table, 4 chairs, a whiteboard with nothing on it, a window that looked out over the station's parking lot. She stood when we came in and shook Helen's hand first, which I noticed and appreciated. Then she gestured to the chairs across from her and sat down and folded her hands on the table and looked at us both with the particular attention of someone who has spent years learning to read what people are not saying as carefully as what they are. I set the folder on the table between us. She did not reach for it immediately. Instead, she said, "Before we start, I want to say something." She looked at Helen. "In March, I sat your son and your daughter in front of my camera. I let them tell their story. I put that segment on the air, and it went out to every household in the Dayton metro area." She paused. "If what Mr. Bennett described in his email is accurate, I helped them do this. I own a piece of what happened. I think you should know that before we go any further." Helen looked at her steadily. "Then help us finish it," she said. Claire nodded once. Then she opened the folder. She read for 31 minutes without speaking. I know because the clock on the conference room wall had a second hand, and I watched it the way I had watched the microwave clock while Helen read the same pages at our kitchen table. Some documents she read twice. The ghost invoices she set aside in a separate stack. The bus bench photograph she held for a long moment before placing it face down, which told me something about her, that I filed away alongside everything else I was learning to notice about people in those weeks. When she finished, she looked up and said, "The pledge." Emily Harper at the Cincinnati Cardiac Unit confirmed in writing that nothing was received, I said. "I have her email in the back section." Claire found it, read it, set it down. She picked up her pen for the first time. "This is 3 legs," she said, and she wrote 3 words on the notepad in front of her. "Documents, confirmation, camera." She explained what she meant. The way a person explains something they have worked out in advance because they knew the conversation was going to arrive here. A story like this required all 3 to withstand the scrutiny that would follow broadcast. Documents she had. Confirmation she had. The third leg was a source on camera on the record with a name and a face the audience could weigh against the story being told. "Both of you?" she asked. "Both of us," Helen said before I could answer. Claire looked at her with something that was close to surprise, and then quickly became something else, a kind of recognition, the look of one person identifying another who has made a hard decision and arrived at it cleanly. We spent the next hour going through my conditions. I had written them in the green notebook beforehand. because I had learned by then that any agreement I entered without written terms was an agreement I could not enforce. No footage of the store exterior that would allow customers to identify it before broadcast. No use of medical records or hospital imagery beyond what I chose to provide. No contact with Nora without my prior knowledge. Full review of the segment transcript before air. Claire accepted each condition, noted it, initialed the notepad beside it. When I finished, she said, "Anything else?" "One more," I said. I slid a single page across the table, a transcript Nora had prepared 3 weeks earlier. She had been alone in the back room doing inventory when Ryan and Melissa arrived unannounced and used the stockroom to argue privately, not knowing the shelf intercom to the register was still open. Nora had written down every word she heard, dated it, and signed it. The conversation covered the transfer agreement, the plan to work through Helen and Ryan's growing panic. "I need you to verify this independently before you use it." Claire read the transcript. She set it down. She looked at me across the table with the expression of someone who has just found the third point that makes a triangle solid. "Taping will be Friday," she said. "Air date Tuesday, 10 o'clock. She paused. "Standard practice means my station calls Ryan and Melissa for comment on Monday. We don't ambush people. Real journalism knocks first." She let that land. "Which means your family has approximately 30 hours between Monday afternoon and Tuesday evening to do whatever they decide to do. I want you to be prepared for that." I told her I had been preparing for it since April. She almost smiled. Then she slid a 2-page document across the table, the on-camera interview agreement, standard station language, with a blank section at the bottom labeled Participant Conditions, where my terms had already been typed in clean paragraphs by someone who had clearly been asked to prepare this before the meeting. I read every line. I initialed each condition. I signed at the bottom in blue ink, the same way I had been signing every document since February, deliberately, completely, without leaving any room for a later claim that I had not understood what I was agreeing to. Helen signed beside me. Her handwriting was steadier than mine. On the drive home, we did not talk for the first 20 minutes. The highway was quiet in the early evening, the particular amber light of a June sunset, making everything along the road look temporarily gilded, temporarily at peace. Helen watched it out the passenger window with her hands folded in her lap. Then she said, "Are you scared?" I thought about it honestly, the way she deserves to be answered. "Not of them," I said. "Of what comes after. Of what the store looks like on Wednesday morning. Of what this city looks like when it's over." Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over and put her hand on my arm just above the wrist, the way she has reached for me in the dark for 40 years. "Wednesday morning," she said, "you open the store at 7, same as always. I'll make the coffee." I kept my eyes on the road. My throat did the unreliable thing it had been doing since April 14th, the thing I had been managing in stairwells and parked cars and back rooms for months. I let it do it this time. Nobody was watching. It was just the two of us and the amber highway and 40 years of reasons to hold on. The station made its calls on Monday afternoon at 2 o'clock. I know the exact time, because Claire had told me to expect it between 1 and 3, and I had been watching the clock above the register since noon, with the specific patience of a man who has spent 35 years waiting for deliveries that arrive when they arrive, and not a minute before. Nora was at the register. I was in the back room with the door half open, restocking the canned goods shelf, doing something ordinary with my hands, because ordinary tasks are what keep a man level when everything around him is moving at a speed he cannot control. My phone rang at 2:14. "Ryan." I let it go to voicemail. It rang again at 2:22. "Ryan." I let it go. By 4:30 he had called 9 times. I listened to each voicemail in sequence, standing in the back room with the door closed. The way you listen to a weather system move through, tracking its direction, measuring its intensity, noting what it tells you about what is coming next. The first voicemail was the reasonable one. "Dad, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding with the news station. Give me a call when you get a chance." His voice was measured, almost casual, the voice of a man who has not yet decided how frightened to be. The third was the negotiating one. "Look, Dad, I understand you have concerns. We all have concerns. Let's sit down like adults and work this out before it becomes something nobody wants it to become. There are solutions here that work for everyone. Just call me back." The fifth was the one where the measured quality began to slip. "Dad, this is getting out of hand. Melissa is upset. The whole family is upset. You're dragging everyone into this, not just us. You're doing this to all of us, not just me and Melissa. Think about what you're actually doing here." The seventh was where I heard something I had not heard from my son in many years, the specific pitch of genuine fear, not performed for effect, but actual, the sound of a man who has looked at the approaching thing clearly for the first time and does not like what he sees. "Dad, please, just call me back." The ninth was the one that told me everything I needed to know about which version of Ryan Bennett I was actually dealing with. "You want to blow this family up? Fine. Go ahead. But don't come looking for us when it's over. Don't call. Don't show up. You made your choice." I set the phone on the shelf beside the canned tomatoes and stood there for a moment. Then I picked up a can of crushed tomatoes, checked the label, and placed it on the correct shelf. Then another. The work steadied me the way it always has, the simple honesty of a thing that goes where it belongs and stays there. Melissa called twice. She did not leave voicemails. The family group chat, which had been quiet since the night of April 14th, when 12 people read 2 cruel messages and said nothing, came alive at 4:45, with the specific energy of people who had been privately informed of something and were now performing their response publicly. Cousins I had not spoken to since Helen's surgery posted paragraphs about loyalty and family and the importance of working things out privately. My brother-in-law Gary, who sends birthday gifts 6 days late, sent a voice message saying he hoped I knew what I was doing. An aunt I had not seen in 3 years commented that airing family business in public was not something our family did. I read each message once and put the phone face down on the counter. The envelope arrived Tuesday morning before we opened. Heavy paper, a law firm's name printed in the upper left corner in the kind of font that is chosen specifically to communicate authority and expense. I opened it at the register with my reading glasses on and a cup of coffee going warm beside me. It was a cease and desist letter. 3 pages dense with legal language asserting that I had made false and defamatory statements regarding Helen's Heart Project and its officers, that these statements had caused material harm to the reputations and business interests of the named parties, and that should I continue to make or publish such statements, the Foundation reserved the right to pursue all available legal remedies, including civil litigation. I read it twice. Then I took out my phone and searched for the legal standard I already half knew from 35 years of signing contracts and reading the fine print on every document anyone had ever put in front of me. In the United States, truth is an absolute defense against defamation. This is one of the oldest principles in American defamation law. A statement cannot be considered defamatory if it is factually accurate, regardless of how damaging that accurate statement may be to the subject's reputation. The burden of proof in a defamation case falls on the plaintiff, meaning Ryan and Melissa would be required to demonstrate not only that my statements had harmed them, but that those statements were false. Every figure I had given Claire Dawson came from documents. Every document had a date and a source. Every source could be verified independently. They were not threatening me because I was lying. They were threatening me because I was not. I folded the letter, placed it in the folder behind the tab I had labeled in block letters weeks earlier, and closed the cover. Then I called Claire. "It came," I said when she picked up. "I expected it would," she said. "Does it change anything for you?" I looked around the store. The cream linoleum, the clicking ceiling fan I still had, not fixed the shelves I had built myself in 1991, the front window where the morning light came in at the same angle it had come in for 35 years. Nora was wiping down the deli counter with the methodical care she brings to everything, humming something low under her breath. "No," I said. "It does not change anything." "Taping is still Friday," Claire said. 10 o'clock Tuesday. I hung up. Helen called from home to ask if I wanted her to bring lunch to the store. I said yes. I said whatever she felt like making was fine. She said she was thinking grilled cheese. I said that sounded exactly right. At 3 in the afternoon, Ryan's truck pulled into the parking lot across the street and sat there for 11 minutes with the engine running. Then it pulled out and drove away. I watched it from behind the front window, my hands in my apron pockets, and I did not move until it was gone. You're listening to Dad's Revenge Stories. Before I reveal how this confrontation unfolded and the exact truth that aired at 10 o'clock, please comment "Justice" down below, so I know you're still with me. Also, please note, the upcoming sequence contains fictional dramatizations and creative additions. If this style of narrative isn't for you, feel free to stop watching right here. I was still at the store at 11:45 that night. I had sent Nora home at 6, told her everything was fine, told her to get some rest before Tuesday. She had looked at me the way she looks at inventory numbers that do not add up with the specific patience of someone who knows the discrepancy is there and is choosing to wait for the right moment to address it. She put on her coat, picked up her bag, and paused at the door. "Walter," she said. "I know," I said. She nodded and left. That is the conversation we have been having for 22 years, in various forms about various things. We have never needed more words than that. I stayed because the store is where I think clearly. It has always been that way, the familiar smell of the place. Coffee and cardboard, and the faint sweetness of the produce section, the click of the ceiling fan, the particular silence of a small business after closing, when everything is exactly where it belongs, and the books are balanced, and the floor has been swept. I had been doing my best thinking at this counter for 35 years, and I was not about to stop on the night before the most consequential Tuesday of my life. I was going through the week's receivables when the headlights swept across the front window. 2 cars. Ryan's truck first, then Melissa's sedan pulling in behind it. They parked side by side in the lot across the street and sat for a moment before the doors opened, and I watched them cross toward the store together in the orange light of the parking lot lamps, Ryan in a dark jacket, Melissa with her arms crossed against the night air, both of them moving with the purposeful speed of people who have made a decision and are committed to it before they lose their nerve. I unlocked the front door before Ryan could knock. He was carrying a duffel bag. Dark canvas, the kind sold at sporting goods stores, zippered across the top. He set it on the counter between us, without preamble, without greeting, without the usual architecture of a conversation that is working up to something. He unzipped it and pulled the sides apart so I could see what was inside. Banded stacks of bills. Neat uniform, the kind of bundling that comes from a bank rather than a drawer. I did not touch them. I looked at the bag the way I look at any invoice before I decide whether to accept it carefully, completely, without letting the number on the page tell me how to feel before I have decided how to feel. $30,000, Ryan said. Cash. Tonight. Melissa moved to stand beside her brother. She had composed her face into something that was meant to look like sincerity, and landed approximately 3 degrees short of it, the way an imitation of a thing always reveals itself in the distance between the copy and the original. She said, "We want to fix this. We know things got out of hand. We know mistakes were made." The passive construction was careful mistakes were made, not we made mistakes, not I made mistakes, the grammar of accountability without the substance of it. Take the money. Call the station tonight and tell Claire Dawson the story has been misrepresented. Tell her it was a family misunderstanding and you are retracting your participation. The segment does not air. The foundation dissolves quietly in the fall. We move forward. I looked at my son. I looked at my daughter. I looked at the bag between us on the counter where 35 years of honest transactions had taken place, where my father had paid for his groceries when I first opened, and where his grandchildren had reached up to the penny dish when they were small enough that reaching up was something they still had to do. I will tell you the truth about that moment, because I promised myself at the beginning of this that the truth was the only thing worth telling. I wanted the money. Not for myself. I have never wanted money for myself beyond what the store provides and what Helen and I need to live decently. I wanted it for Helen, for the cardiac rehabilitation copays and the follow-up imaging and the October echo and the years of monitoring that a repaired heart valve requires. I wanted it because $30,000 is real, and it is present, and it would solve right now tonight the specific financial pressure that had been sitting on my chest since April. Every version of me that had ever said it's okay was standing in that store at midnight adding up the reasons. Then Melissa said, "If you do this, you lose us. We will not forgive this, Dad. You will not see us again. You will not see any grandchildren we might have. You are choosing a news segment over your own family." I looked at her. I looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, which is what Melissa does when she is less certain than she is performing. "You left your mother alone on the day she might not have woken up," I said. My voice came out quiet and level the way it comes out when I am most certain of what I am saying. "You were in a hotel ballroom counting donation money while her chest was open on a table. You put her face on a bus bench to advertise your salon. You brought me a contract that would have taken everything she and I built together and given it to you for free." I put my hand flat on the counter beside the bag, not touching it. "I didn't lose you on the night this segment airs. I lost you on April 14th at 7:26 in the morning when those doors closed, and you were nowhere near them." Ryan's jaw tightened. Something moved through his eyes. Not guilt. I do not think it was guilt, but the specific pain of a man who has heard a true thing said plainly and has no prepared response for it because all of his preparation assumed the other person would eventually negotiate. Melissa picked up the bag. "You'll regret this," she said. The same words she had used in the store 2 months earlier when I had refused to sign the transfer agreement. I noticed she had not found new ones. They left. I locked the door behind them and stood at the window and watched the 2 sets of taillights cross the empty parking lot and turn onto Carpenter Street and disappear into the dark. Then I turned around and looked at my store, the shelves I had built, the counter I had stood behind, the ceiling fan, clicking on every 4th rotation, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not relief, not triumph. Something quieter than both. The specific peace of a man who has finally put down something he has been carrying so long, he stopped noticing the weight. I turned off the register light. I picked up my jacket and the folder and the green notebook. I locked up and drove home and parked in the driveway and sat for a moment in the dark car, looking at the lit window of the bedroom where Helen was reading before sleep, the yellow warmth of the lamp visible through the curtain. Then I went inside. Helen looked up from her book. "How is the store?" she asked. "Quiet," I said. "Come to bed." Tuesday came the way consequential days always come, looking exactly like any other day until it doesn't. I opened the store at 7. I swept the floor. I restocked the bread aisle and checked the refrigerator seals, and wrote the week's produce order in the green notebook, and drank my coffee standing at the counter the way I have done for 35 years. Nora arrived at 8 and did not ask me anything, which was the right thing to do. We worked through the morning rush and the quiet middle hours of the afternoon in the comfortable parallel rhythm of two people who have shared a workspace long enough that they have stopped needing to narrate it. Helen called at noon to say she had walked 3 blocks that morning, the farthest she had gone since surgery. Her voice had the particular quality it gets when she is pleased with herself, but trying not to show it, the quality I fell in love with, sometime around our 3rd month of marriage, and have never stopped finding. I told her that was wonderful. I told her I would be home by 6. At 4 in the afternoon, the station aired the 15-second promotional spot. He had watched the blurred check and the voiceover and the words, "Where did the money really go?" and had concluded with the specific confidence of a man who has never been caught that it must be about a competitor. His caption read, "Some people in this business have no integrity. Tune in tonight at 10 and see for yourself." He had personally delivered his entire customer list to the segment about him. Nora said she stared at her phone for a full minute before she put it down. A customer told me about the promo itself. At 4:45, Margaret Kowalski, who had come in for her weekly groceries and who had been watching the local news in her kitchen when the promo appeared between segments. She described it carefully the way she describes everything, with the sequential precision of a woman who was an elementary school teacher for 30 years and learned that the order of information matters. A blurred check, a voiceover, a local feel-good fundraiser. Where did the money really go? Tuesday at 10. No names, no faces, just the shape of the thing visible enough to draw attention, specific enough to be unmistakable to anyone who already knew what it referred to. Margaret looked at me across the counter with an expression I had not seen on her face before, not the warm sympathy of her first visit when she had donated $300 and come to embrace me in the store, but something more complicated. The specific discomfort of a person beginning to understand that the thing they participated in was not what they believed it to be. "Walter," she said, "is it about Ryan and Melissa?" "Watch it tonight," I said. "Then come see me tomorrow if you want to talk." She nodded and paid for her groceries and left without her usual 5 minutes of conversation about the weather and her garden and her daughter in Columbus. I watched her go and felt the day shift into its final gear. I closed the store at 6, drove home and ate dinner with Helen at the kitchen table. She had made pot roast, the same pot roast she has made on significant occasions for 40 years, the one with the carrots cut in thick rounds, and the gravy she builds from the drippings, the way her mother taught her. I did not ask why she had made it tonight. I understood why she had made it tonight. We did the dishes together. We watched the 7 o'clock news, which contained nothing of consequence. We sat in the living room, and Helen read, and I looked at the same page of the same book for 40 minutes without absorbing a single word. At 9:55, I turned on the television. Helen set her book on the side table and sat beside me on the couch, close enough that her arm was against mine, and we watched the last 5 minutes of the program before ours, with the particular stillness of two people waiting for a train they have been walking toward for a very long time. The segment ran third after a water main break on the west side and before the weather forecast. "Follow the money," Claire's voice said, over the opening graphic, steady and level as a carpenter's line. Tonight, a Dayton family raised nearly $150,000 for a mother's heart surgery. We follow the money to find out where it went. The graphics built themselves on screen line by line. $147,000 raised. $4,000 received by the patient's household. $20,000 pledged to a Cincinnati cardiac unit from a hotel ballroom podium. $0 received by that unit confirmed in writing by the hospital's own patient services department. Then the invoices. Ryan's truck payments, his salon renovation charges, the resort booking labeled Strategic Planning Retreat. Rendered in clean broadcast yellow against a dark background, each line appearing with the quiet inevitability of numbers that have been waiting to be seen. Then Emily Harper's written confirmation, her title and department visible beneath her name. Then a statement from the Ohio Secretary of State's office confirming the trade name registration of Bennett Family Fund, dated March 19th, 6 weeks before the surgery it purported to support. Then Claire's voice steady over a still image of 2 text message bubbles enlarged to fill the screen. She read them slowly. Busy. Handle it yourself, Dad. Then the second. She made it. Stop turning this into our problem. Helen's hand found mine in the dark. Her grip was firm and certain, the grip of someone who has decided exactly where she stands and has no intention of moving. Across town at the dealership where Ryan had sold 14 cars last month, Derek Walsh, the floor manager who had shared the Community Heroes segment on the dealership's Facebook page in March, was closing up the showroom with 3 salespeople when the television mounted above the finance office door began showing his employee's face beneath the words, "Follow the money." He watched the segment from beginning to end without speaking. Then he sent an email to the dealership owner that contained 4 sentences and the subject line, "We need to talk tonight." At Melissa's salon on the west side, the Tuesday evening receptionist had the small television behind the front desk tuned to Channel 7 out of habit. She watched the segment alone in the empty salon, the last client having left 40 minutes earlier. She called Melissa twice. Melissa did not answer. Ryan was at a client dinner at a steakhouse on the north side when his phone began to vibrate against the white tablecloth with the continuous urgency of something that cannot be ignored. He looked at the screen. Then he looked up at the television mounted on the wall above the bar, which was tuned to Channel 7, which was showing his name in broadcast yellow beneath the words, "Where did the money go?" His client said, "Ryan, isn't that—" Ryan stood up too fast. His water glass went over. His phone slid off the table and hit the tile floor, and the screen went dark. At Melissa's salon, her phone rang a 3rd time. This time she answered. I do not know what was said. I know only what the receptionist described later, that Melissa's voice when she spoke was the voice of someone who has spent months being absolutely certain and has arrived in one television segment at the end of that certainty. Her phone slipped from her hand into the shampoo bowl beside her, and the screen went dark beneath 2 inches of water. In my living room, the woman on the television said, in a voice I recognized as my own, I have been saying, "It's okay," my whole life. It was never okay. I just kept absorbing the cost and calling it love. Helen pressed her face against my shoulder. I put my arm around her. The green line on the dark screen, the one that had measured her heartbeat through the longest night of my life, was not here tonight, but I could feel her breathing steady, and even the deep, ordinary miracle of a repaired heart doing its quiet work. I reached over and turned off the television. The house was very still. Then my phone began to fill. I did not read the messages that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the phone face up between my hands and watched the notification count climb 12, 31, 74, 116, and I read the names of the senders. The way I had read the names on the group chat, read receipts in April quietly and permanently, filing each one in the part of my memory that keeps records without being asked. Then I turned the phone face down and went to bed. Helen was already asleep. I lay beside her in the dark, and listened to her breathe the same deep, even rhythm I had listened to in the surgical waiting room for 9 hours, except now it was here in our bed on Carpenter Street, with the window cracked, the way she likes it in summer, and the neighbor's dog barking twice at something in the dark, and then going quiet. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary night, which is the most extraordinary thing I know. I slept 4 hours. I was at the store by 6:15. The first person to come to the door before we opened was Donna Price, who has lived 4 houses down from us for 23 years and who donated $150 to a Heart for Mom in March and shared the campaign link to her neighborhood Facebook group with the caption, "Please give if you can. These are good people." She knocked at 6:40 while I was still setting up the register, and when I unlocked the door, she was standing on the sidewalk, holding a covered dish with both hands and looking at the ground, the way people look at the ground when they cannot yet look at your face. I opened the door wide. She came in. She set the dish on the counter, a casserole still warm, the kind she brings to people after funerals and hospital stays and other occasions when food is the only honest currency available. Then she looked up at me and her eyes were red at the rims, and she pressed her lips together hard before she could speak. "Walter," she said, "I am so sorry. I shared that page to everyone I know. I told them it was real. I told them your family needed help." Her voice broke on the last word, not dramatically, but the way voices break when the thing being said is genuinely meant. "I should have asked you directly. I should have come to the store and asked you." I came around the counter and put my hand on her shoulder. "You gave because you wanted to help Helen," I said. "That part was real. What happened to the money after that's not on you?" She cried then, briefly and quietly, and I handed her a paper towel from the roll beside the register, because it was what I had. And she laughed a little through the tears, the way people do when the gesture is imperfect and exactly right. And then she straightened up and said she would be back on Friday for her regular groceries. I told her I would save her the good sourdough. Nora arrived at 7:58, 2 minutes before her usual time, which for Nora Collins is the equivalent of arriving an hour early. She looked at the casserole on the counter and then at me and said, "How many calls?" "I stopped counting at 200, I said. She nodded and tied on her apron and took her place at the register without another word. That is Nora. That has always been Nora. By 9 in the morning, the campaign page had been updated with a gray banner across the top. The text read, "This campaign is currently under review. Withdrawals have been suspended pending documentation." The platform had received my formal complaint 6 weeks earlier and had been conducting its own investigation in parallel with everything else. The frozen campaign meant that the remaining funds, whatever remained after the truck and the salon renovation and the resort and the cash withdrawals I had not yet fully accounted for, could not be moved or accessed by Ryan or Melissa until the review concluded. The review would conclude, as these things do, when the documentation is thorough in favor of the documented party. The funds would be returned to donors. Every dollar that strangers had given in Helen's name would travel back out the same door it had entered, which was not justice exactly, but was the next closest thing the correction of a record that had been falsified. I watched the campaign total count down over the following days, the way I had watched it count up in March from the same register counter on the same laptop. When it reached 0, I felt something I had not anticipated, not satisfaction, not relief, but a kind of clean finality, the specific feeling of a ledger that has been reconciled after a long discrepancy. The number that had caused so much damage had returned to where it started. What came after would be built differently. Derek Walsh called the store on Wednesday morning. He identified himself as the floor manager at the dealership where Ryan had worked, and said he was calling as a professional courtesy to let me know that Ryan's employment had been terminated the previous evening effective immediately following a review of the situation that had come to light through the broadcast. He said the dealership had always held its employees to a standard of integrity, and that the events described in the segment were inconsistent with that standard. He spoke carefully the way people speak when they are aware that what they say may be repeated. I thanked him for calling. I did not say anything else. There was nothing else to say. Pastor Gene Whitfield called that same afternoon. He had stood at his pulpit and recommended the campaign to his congregation. He had told them that Ryan and Melissa were doing God's work and that their generosity would be rewarded. He called to tell me that the church had already contacted the Cincinnati Cardiac Unit directly and was arranging to send the full amount the congregation had donated, $4,200, straight to the hospital's Family Assistance Fund in Helen's name. No intermediary, no foundation, straight to the unit that had opened my wife's chest and sewn her back together. I thanked him. My throat did the thing it had been doing since April. By Thursday, the story had moved beyond Dayton. A regional news aggregator picked it up. Then a national morning program ran 40 seconds of it in their daily segment on consumer fraud. The text message graphic, busy. Handle it yourself. Dad and she made it. Stop turning this into our problem, was shared by people in time zones. I have never visited above captions in languages I cannot read. Read over breakfast tables by strangers who had never heard of Carpenter Street, or Bennett's Grocery, or Helen's Repaired Heart. Margaret Kowalski came back on Thursday as she had said she would. She did not bring a dish. She's brought her checkbook. She asked me quietly across the counter where her mother had once bought penny candy when I first opened whether there was a way to give directly to Helen's medical costs without going through anyone else. I gave her Emily Harper's contact information at the Cincinnati Cardiac Unit. I told her the Family Assistance Fund accepted direct contributions and applied them straight to patient accounts. I told her not 1 cent of it would pass through any other hands. She wrote the check at the counter. $300, the same amount she had donated the first time. She tore it out and handed it across to me, and this time when she left, she stopped at the door and turned around. "Walter," she said. 35 years. You never once shortchanged anybody." I looked at her. "No," I said. "I never did." She nodded and went out into the morning, and the bell above the door settled, and Nora looked at me from the register with the expression she uses when she has something to say and has decided this is not the moment to say it. I looked back at her. She turned to the next customer. The store was full. The store was always full on Thursday mornings. Some things do not change, which is the closest thing to grace I know. The consequences arrived not as lightning, but as paperwork, which is how consequences actually move when the record is clean. Helen's Heart Project filed its own dissolution with the Ohio Secretary of State 2 weeks after the broadcast, a single page submitted quietly before the state's Charitable Compliance Office could initiate proceedings. The Bennett Family Fund trade name registration was surrendered the same week. Both actions were in their way admissions, the kind made by people who have looked at the approaching thing clearly and decided that voluntary retreat is preferable to being removed. The campaign funds returned to donors over the following 3 weeks. Every dollar walked back out the same door it had entered. I watched the refund confirmations arrive in my email forwarded by the platform as a courtesy to the complaint filer, and I felt the specific piece of a ledger reconciled after a long and painful discrepancy. The money had never behaved like money around my family. It was better that it went home clean. By the end of July, Emily Harper called from Cincinnati. Her voice carried a warmth she was not trying to conceal. She told me that the Cardiac Unit's Family Assistance Fund had received enough in direct donations earmarked specifically for Helen's account to cover the outstanding balance in full, with enough remaining to help the family after us, whoever they turned out to be. The money came back for Helen. It just refused to pass through anyone else's hands to get there. Sunday dinner at our house started as a one-time thing in September and became, without anyone deciding it should, a weekly fact. Nora brings apple pie. Claire comes when her Tuesday broadcast schedule allows, still in her station lanyard, drinking her coffee black. Emily drives up from Cincinnati once a month. Pastor Whitfield says grace briefly and without theater. 2 chairs at the end of the table were not replaced. Spring came to Dayton the way it always does, slow and tentative, then all at once. The tulips Helen planted along the front walk came up red again, more of them than last year, as though the ground had been holding something in reserve through the long cold months, saving it for a moment when it would mean more. I stood on the porch the first morning I noticed them, and looked at them for a while without going inside. 40 years of springs on Carpenter Street. Some of them ordinary. Some of them the kind that arrive after a winter you were not certain you would get through. This one was the second kind, and the tulips seemed to know it. I opened the store at 7 each morning. The floor needed the same sweeping it had always needed. The bread aisle needed the same restocking. The refrigerator door seal along the back wall still needed that extra tug to close properly, and the ceiling fan above the register still clicked on every 4th rotation. I still had not fixed it. Some things you leave because they have become part of the sound of a place, and the sound of a place is not nothing. It is the accumulated evidence of continuity, proof that a thing has been here long enough to develop its own particular rhythms, its own small, reliable music. Nora had rearranged the display near the front window sometime in March, a small change that made the whole entrance look more open and welcoming. And I had noticed it, and not said anything because it was the right call, and she had known it was the right call without needing to ask. 22 years of working alongside a person teaches you when to speak and when the work itself is the conversation. We had that. We had always had that. I understood that spring how much I had depended on it through everything that had happened, and how much I had never adequately said so. I said so one Tuesday morning in April before we opened. She was setting up the deli counter, and I was at the register going through the week's receivables, and I stopped what I was doing and looked at her across the store and said, "Nora, I don't know what I would have done without you this past year." She looked up from the cutting board. She considered me for a moment with the expression she reserves for statements that require a response she has not yet decided on. Then she said, "You would have done exactly what you did. Slower, maybe, and with worse filing." She went back to the cutting board. I went back to the receivables. That was the whole conversation, and it was enough. An envelope arrived in April, exactly 1 year after the photograph. Ryan's handwriting on the front. The blocky, slightly forward-leaning print he has used since grade school, unchanged in 40 years. The way some things about a person remain stubbornly themselves, regardless of everything else that shifts. I stood at the kitchen counter and held it for a moment before opening it. Not from reluctance. From the instinct of a man who has learned to take a breath before he handles anything that has been in contact with a situation that cost him a great deal. Inside, no letter. No explanation. No apology, which I had known better than to expect, and had hoped for anyway, the way you hope for things you know better than to expect. Just a check. $8,000. The memo line read, "Repayment in full." I held it for a long time. I thought about the Sunday afternoon phone call 11 months before Helen's diagnosis, the easy confidence of Ryan's voice when he said, "I've got this handled," the way he used the word, absolutely the way people use it when they mean the opposite. I thought about the novelty check and the photographer and the $2,000 sourced from strangers' donations presented as a son's devotion. I thought about a lot of things standing at that counter with a check in my hand that had arrived without a single word of explanation. Then I walked to the home office and opened the folder. 3 inches of paper, dates and amounts and screenshots and invoices and a photograph of a bus bench and a transcript of a recording and a written confirmation from a hospital and a cease and desist letter from a law firm that had not understood what it was threatening. I placed the check behind the last tab, the final page of a record that had taken a year to complete. I closed the cover. The spine still read, Helen. Everything in the block letters I had written the night I understood that what I was building was not just a file but a shelter. That seemed right. That seemed like exactly the right place for it to end. Sunday dinner that May had 8 people around a table built for 6 with the leaf in and the good napkins out, and Helen's pot roast in the center. The pot roast she makes for occasions, the one with the carrots cut in thick rounds and the gravy built from the drippings, the way her mother taught her a recipe that has fed this family through every significant thing that has ever happened to it and will outlast all of us by decades. Nora sat at the corner she has claimed since the first time she came to dinner in October, the spot where she can see both the kitchen door and the front window, which is exactly where Nora would choose to sit, because she likes to know what is coming from both directions. Claire was beside her, still in her station lanyard, because she had come straight from the Tuesday broadcast, drinking her coffee black, the way she always does, in the specific way of a person who decided long ago that she does not have time for the things she does not need. Emily had driven up from Cincinnati and was telling Helen about a family the cardiac unit had helped that month, a story Helen was listening to with the focused warmth of someone who understands precisely what it means to be on the other side of that kind of help. Pastor Whitfield sat at the far end and said grace before the meal, briefly and without theater, the way grace is best said as a genuine thing rather than a performance of one. Tommy Bach had come, which surprised me, and then did not surprise me at all. He sat between Nora and Claire and ate 2 helpings of pot roast and told a story about a delivery mix-up that had the table laughing in the way a table laughs when it has forgotten briefly and gratefully that it was ever anything other than this. 2 chairs at the end of the table had not been replaced. Nobody mentioned them. Nobody needed to. Helen reached for the water pitcher midway through the meal and knocked her glass. It went over a small white lake spreading across the good tablecloth toward the pot roast, and she grabbed for napkins with both hands and looked at me with the particular expression she saves for moments she cannot fix, the expression that has been part of her face for 40 years and that I have loved every version of. "It's okay," she started. I covered her hand with mine. The table went quiet for just a moment, not the uncomfortable quiet of a room that does not know what to do, but the specific quiet of people who understand that something is about to be said that they should hear. "Some things aren't okay," I said quietly. "And we never have to pretend they are again." Helen looked at me across the table. Across 40 years of mornings and Tuesday drives, and 35 years of a store that smelled like coffee and cardboard, and the accumulated honesty of a life conducted without shortcuts. The table went back to itself. Tommy reached for the bread. Claire poured more coffee. Nora cut the apple pie she had brought and distributed it with the authority of someone who has decided how large everyone's slice should be and is not taking questions. Helen squeezed my hand once before letting go. Outside, the May evening was doing what May evenings do in Ohio, settling into the long, amber, unhurried light of a day that is not yet willing to end. The tulips along the front walk were still open. The store would need opening at 7 tomorrow. The ceiling fan would click on every 4th rotation, and I would not fix it because some sounds are worth keeping. That is my story. 1 photograph. 2 texts I will never unread. And the first time in 67 years that I said what I meant and meant what I said. I am 67 years old, and the most expensive lesson I ever learned cost nothing to learn and everything to ignore. For 35 years, I kept honest books, every number balanced, every invoice filed. But inside my own family, I let the ledger run crooked because I told myself that keeping the peace was worth more than keeping score. It was not. It never is. Here is what I know now. God does not ask us to absorb cruelty and call it love. He asks us to be honest with our books, with our families, and most of all with ourselves. If I could go back, I would tell the younger Walter Bennett, this: do not wait until the people you love are on a surgical table to find out who shows up. Pay attention earlier. An honest question asked in time costs far less than a folder full of evidence assembled too late. This is a grandpa stories kind of truth, the kind that takes a lifetime to earn and 10 seconds to say. Grandpa stories do not always have happy endings, but they have honest ones, and honest is enough. Some family story moments break you open in ways you never expected. This family story broke me open and rebuilt me cleaner. I would not trade it. If something in this story sat with you, leave a word in the comments. Share it with someone who needs permission to stop saying it's okay. And if you want more grandpa stories and family story truths from this channel, subscribe so you never miss one. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know. These stories contain fictional elements crafted for the purpose of reflection and life lessons. If this kind of content is not for you, we respect that completely. There is something out there made just for you, and we hope you find it.